In the hell of the Second World War, some jobs were basically a death sentence. A role where the odds were so against you, just surviving seemed almost impossible. And you've probably heard the story of one such job, a post with a shocking, hard-to-believe 80% death rate, the German Flak gunner. But is that number real? What made the life of a flak gunner so dangerous? And as we look deeper, an even bigger question comes up. Was this really the deadliest job of World War II? In this video, we're going to dive into the world of the flak crews and the famous 88mm guns they used. We'll find out the truth behind those shocking death claims. Then, we'll travel into the cramped steel coffins of the U-boat sailors and march onto the frozen, bloody fields of the Eastern Front. By comparing these three uniquely scary jobs, we'll reveal the shocking, real truth about the deadliest jobs of the war. Let's begin. To understand why the story of an 80% death rate for flak crews even exists, we first have to understand the weapon they used. The story starts not in the chaos of 1944, but in the quiet, secret rearming of Germany in the early 1930s. Forbidden by the Treaty of Versailles from making new artillery, German engineers secretly worked with Swedish partners on a new type of anti-aircraft gun. And what they made was an amazing piece of engineering, the 8.8cm flak gun. A weapon so useful, so deadly, and so ahead of its time, it would become one of the most feared guns in the entire war. Everyone called it the Acht in German and the 88 by the Allies, and it earned its reputation in battle. A standard flak crew was a team of up to 10 men, and each had an important job. You had the gun commander, the spotters, the gunner who aimed the weapon, the loaders who fed it shells, and the fuse setters who set the shells to explode at the right height. Working together perfectly, a trained crew could fire 15 to 20 heavy shells a minute into the sky. Each high-explosive shell was made to blow up in the path of enemy bombers, creating a deadly flak box, a cube of air filled with thousands of pieces of fast-moving metal. The gun's performance was amazing. It could throw a 20-pound shell to a height of over 26,000 feet, more than high enough to reach the Allied heavy bombers. Its advanced aiming system, an early kind of computer known as the Kommandogerät, could figure out a target's speed, height, and direction, giving exact aiming information to the guns. In the early years, this system was scarily good. But the 88 had a secret. It had two uses. It fired shells fast and straight, which made it an amazing tank killer. This was found out by accident during the Spanish Civil War. With few planes to shoot at, the crews started trying it out on ground targets. It was in the Battle of France in 1940 that this secret strength became famous. When faced with heavily armored British and French tanks that German anti-tank guns couldn't damage, the 88s were called in. They destroyed the Allied tanks from distances no one thought possible. This was even more true in the open deserts of North Africa and the huge plains of the Eastern Front. Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, famously used his flak guns as bait, luring enemy tanks into deadly traps. In the early days of the war, when the German Air Force ruled the skies, life as a flak gunner was fairly safe. But this was a false quiet before a massive storm. By 1943, the air war had completely changed. The factory power of the United States and the non-stop British Royal Air Force started bombing them day and night. Day after day, night after night, hundreds, then thousands of bombers filled the skies over Germany. And where were the flak crews? They were placed right in the center of these attacks. Their guns formed protective rings around the most important targets: factories, oil refineries, submarine pens, and big cities. They were the defenders of Germany's heartland, and so they became main targets themselves. Allied air forces didn't just see flak as something in the way, they saw it as a threat to be wiped out. They developed brutal tactics to destroy the guns. Fighter bombers like the P-47 Thunderbolt would scream down, shooting up the open gun pits with their cannons and machine guns. But far more terrifying were the new special bombs. bombers began dropping time-fused cluster bombs made to explode in the air right above the flak positions, showering the crews with metal splinters. They also used white phosphorus, a chemical that would splash over a large area and burn right through to the bone. Under this constant attack, the death rates for flak crews shot up. In the final, desperate days of the war, it's believed that some units in the hardest-hit areas saw death rates jump to between 50 and 70%, with numbers getting even higher in the last chaotic months. The legend of an 80% death rate was likely born in these specific places of death, in places like the Ruhr Valley, known as Flak Alley, or the doomed city of Berlin. Now, about protection, we have to mention the Flaktürme, or flak towers. These were giant concrete anti-aircraft towers built in cities like Berlin, Hamburg, and Vienna. These were fortresses with reinforced concrete walls up to 11 feet thick, and they even had hospitals and shelters for thousands of people. But these were rare. Most of Germany's flak guns were in quickly dug pits or open fields, with almost no protection. The stress was huge. The men lived always on edge, suffering from what Allied doctors called flak-happy syndrome, a kind of severe combat stress. As the war went on and Germany ran out of men, the crews changed. By the end, they were often old men, wounded soldiers, and most famously, teenage boys from the Hitler Youth. Starting in 1943, entire school classes of boys, some as young as 14, were drafted as Air Force assistants. They had to face the full force of the Allied air attacks, and many were killed. So the image of the flak gunner's job as a death sentence comes from a real horror. The story of 80% deaths might be an overstatement of the total number, but for some men, in some places, it was scarily close to the truth. But even with these horrible losses, the question is still there. Was it the deadliest job? To find the answer, we must leave the burning cities of Germany and go down into the dark, cold Atlantic. The iron coffins of the U-boat, ARM. While flak crews faced a firestorm from the skies, another group of German servicemen faced a cold, cramped, and almost certain death. The world of the U-boat sailor. Of the roughly 41,000 men who served in the U-boat arm, about 30,000 never came back. This is a proven death rate of about 75%. By the numbers, this makes it the single deadliest part of the entire German armed forces. They didn't call their boats iron coffins for nothing. Life on a U-boat was a special kind of misery. Imagine 50 men squeezed into a steel tube no bigger than a subway car for months. The air was a bad mix of diesel fumes, unwashed men, and old food. Men had to share bunks in shifts, a practice called hot bunking. But the real horror started when they found an enemy ship. In the early happy time, U-boats caused great damage, but the Allies adapted with scary speed, creating technologies that doomed the U-boat fleet. High-frequency direction finding, or HFDUF, could find a U-boat's exact spot when it sent a radio message home. Radar on long-range planes made the ocean surface a death trap. And sonar, or ASDIC, could find a sub that was underwater, leading destroyers right to it. To be in a U-boat during a depth charge attack was mental torture. First, the faint ping of sonar. Then, the scary sound of propellers right above them, followed by huge explosions hitting the hull like a giant hammer. If the hull broke open, there was no escape. One very dark fact shows the danger: the fate of the Type 14th milk cow supply U-boats. Their job was to resupply other U-boats at sea, making them top targets. Of the 10 milk cows built, every single one was sunk. While not every crewman died, some survived and became prisoners of war, serving on one was almost a suicide mission. The proven 75% death rate for the U-boat arm is proof of this brutal reality. By the numbers, it was the most dangerous branch. But does the highest death rate automatically make it the worst job? For that, we must turn to the biggest and most brutal part of the war. 2. The meat grinder of the Eastern Front. What if Deadliest isn't just about percentages, but about huge, brutal numbers? The war on the Eastern Front was a war of total destruction. For the average German foot soldier, being sent to Russia was seen by many as a death sentence. While it's hard to figure out an exact death rate for a single soldier, the huge number of deaths tells the story. The German armed forces lost over 80% of their total fighting men on the Eastern Front. Of the roughly 5.3 million German soldiers who died in World War II, over 4 million died in the East. It was a human meat grinder on a giant scale. The dangers were constant and total. There was the enemy, the Red Army, a tough and merciless foe. There was the weather, the twice-a-year Rasputitsa, or season of mud, that turned roads into seas of mud you couldn't cross. And of course, there was general winter. The German army was terribly unprepared for Russian winters, with soldiers in summer clothes facing temperatures of -40 degrees. Frostbite alone caused tens of thousands of injuries. This was clearest in the Battle of Stalingrad. The life expectancy for a new soldier there was sometimes just a few hours. Of the German 6th Army surrounded at Stalingrad, about 91,000 surrendered. Only around 5,000 ever saw Germany again. For those men, the death rate was over 98%. It's complicated to compare these. The U-boat arm had a higher death rate as a specific service branch, but for a soldier at Stalingrad or during a big Soviet attack, the personal risk of death was an everyday reality that could be pretty much 100%. The Eastern Front was the deadliest place to be a German soldier because of the total numbers and constant, terrible violence. 3. The verdict and the shocking truth. So we come back to our main question. A job with an 80% death rate. After looking at the fiery skies over Germany, the deep Atlantic, and the frozen lands of Russia, what is the final answer? First, let's look at the bold claim. Did 80% of all flak gun crews die? What historians agree on is clear. No. That number is an exaggeration, a story born from the real-life hell of certain places in the final years of the war. But to ignore it completely would be to ignore how truly awful their experience was. So, if not the flak crews, who had the deadliest job? If we define deadliest by the highest mathematical chance of being killed in a specific branch, the answer is clear: the U-boat sailor. With a proven death rate of around 75%, no other branch comes close. To join the U-boat service was to accept a 3 in 4 chance of dying a cold, cramped death. However, if we define deadliest by the huge amount of death and violence, the answer moves to the east. The deadliest place for any German soldier to be was the Eastern Front. It was the center of the German army's destruction, where over 4 million German soldiers died. And this is where the surprising truth is. There is no single, simple answer. The horror wasn't one single thing. It was specialized. Each of these jobs was a unique and terrible way to die. The flak gunner was the defender who became the target, hunted down in his own country. His was a war of being dangerously exposed. The U-boat sailor was the hunter who became the hunted, trapped in a metal coffin, his fate sealed by the cold, deep sea. His was a war of feeling trapped and facing sudden, certain death. The Eastern Front soldier was a small piece in the biggest and most brutal land war in history. His death was often slow and awful, from fighting, the weather, and a war meant to destroy everyone.